What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through how I'm actively becoming the person that opportunities chase in terms of building Killer Chaos OS and also in my personal life, because I think this is super important just to talk about. So as always with these videos, the mission is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that I'm actively implementing in terms of mental models and how I'm scaling those mental models into the future to making sure that hey, we're building right and we're building better, and ultimately also just to solve what hurts, basically to come into businesses and organizations and to be the chief problem solvers and ultimately just build back-end infrastructure off of it and just build cool stuff as well. And saying hey, also we want to call in visionaries, basically people aligned with the mission of what it is that we're actively striving for, and ultimately just to network with cool people doing cool things at the same time. So like always, I think this is one of the most important topics that have come to light in my life in terms of just being a person that is the most valuable person within the room, and ultimately just saying hey, when I walk into a room, I know that I may not be the biggest person in the room, and that's okay, but I need to adopt a mindset of trying to be the most valuable person in the room. It doesn't have to be monetary sense, but ultimately just having that mindset of saying hey, how can I give and not expect anything back in return, but ultimately just giving so that I just create more value and just output a lot more is super important. And this is something I'm going super deep in to say hey, how can I create the most amount of value and leverage as well in what it is that I'm doing, so that I am just ultimately just outputting and creating value, so that I'm ultimately just having the mindset of how can I possibly become the most valuable person in the room, because if I don't, how do I expect to build Killer Chaos OS, and how do I expect to constantly just innovate on what it is that we're building, and also just pushing the team and the mission forward. And saying hey, how I'm actively breaking this down into becoming a opportunity magnet is broken down into 4 simple steps. I normally do 5, but four is good enough today, and I think these are super important. So number 1 is 80-20 rule, 80-20 or die. So ultimately saying hey, well, focus lies where leverage lives, the where leverage lives. So ultimately saying that we need to be making sure that we're focusing all of our efforts on creating leverage, and that is where 80% of the wins come from 20% of the moves that we make on a day-to-day basis. Saying that hey, I need to make sure that I'm constantly just am aware of the 20% of the moves that I make, because ultimately that 20% is going to be a result of the 80% of the wins that we do make. So I have to make sure on a day-to-day basis that I'm constantly just using as much of that 20% and creating as much value and leverage within that 20%, because I know that's going to be a result of the 80% of the wins that we are going to make. So I need to make sure that that 20% actually moves the needle, because 80% of the wins that you make normally come from 20% of the moves that you make. And ultimately this is something that I've found to be true for myself, to say hey, things that I didn't think were super high leverage and were a result for the 80% of our wins were ultimately coming down to 20% of the moves that I was making on a day-to-day basis. Saying hey, I'm actively networking, I'm posting videos, I'm ultimately just speaking to people, sharing what it is that I am learning, and also just documenting that as well. Ultimately some of those things just result in the 20%. So ultimately making sure that that 20% is super dialed, and super dialed it will be, and ultimately just pushing the needle forward within that 20%. And saying hey, most people drown in noise, ultimately understanding that hey, some people ultimately focus too much on things that don't move the needle, or the moves that don't actually allow for those 80% of the wins, and ultimately just saying hey, I need to make sure that I'm super doubling down on that, and saying hey, I zoom in on what shifts everything, ultimately to zoom in on what are the needle moving actions that I need to make on a day-to-day basis that ultimately move the needle forward, and ultimately just push what it is that we're doing on a day-to-day basis and what I'm solving for on a day-to-day basis as well. And saying hey, my move is cut low level outreach, ultimately saying hey, I need to just ultimately cut low level outreach and ultimately make sure that I implement strategies in place that ultimately make sure that we're creating as much leverage on the higher level activities, and that I'm focusing on the high leverage activities on a day-to-day basis, things that actually push deals and ultimately allow us to build a great product, and ultimately just push even harder in what it is that we're building on a day-to-day basis. And saying hey, prioritize one DM on X to connect with people, with a certain person. So ultimately saying hey, we need to make sure that we're prioritizing X for our for our means of communication, because ultimately there's more leverage in that, or emails. It just depends, and ultimately just making sure that, hey, we're doubling down on the mediums that work for us, and that we're making sure that we are super dialed in that aspect, and saying, hey, what's the move that you can make on a day-to-day basis, which is pick your higher leverage play and then double down on that, ultimately identifying one leverage play that ultimately results to that 20%, and just listing down. You could literally just list down what are the things that move the needle on a day-to-day basis, and you find the 2-3 main things, and ultimately those also align with the 20%. And that's at least how I go about it, to say, hey, what is the 20% that ultimately results to the 80% of the wins, and I just write that down, and then I ultimately have that, which then allows me to just double down on that 20%, because that 20% needs to be super dialed in if I want to become the most valuable person in the room, and adopt that mindset as well, to say, hey, I am the smallest fish in the room 100%, but I want to be the most valuable person in the room. And how can I do that? Ultimately just giving is the way that I believe that I will be able to achieve that, and then ultimately just allowing me to create more value, not only for me but also for the team as well. And saying, hey, what is the key question that I could be asking here, which is, what's one move that pulls your biggest opportunities? Ultimately just identifying that, and simply you can just write that down, like I do sometimes, to ultimately just write it down and say, hey, what are the things that I can pull today, what are the leverage points or levers that I could pull today that ultimately create the biggest or the largest amount of opportunities, and then absolutely just double down on that. And that ultimately has moved the needle in certain situations, and certain situations, those just doing that simple action has ultimately resulted in so many wins, and so many wins that I probably wouldn't have gotten if it wasn't solely for just prioritizing that and saying, hey, invert the problem. MVPs are your problem solvers. So I like to speak about MVPs all the time, in terms of what we build, in terms of making sure that the products that we're building for our clients are ultimately MVPs, and we also just constantly iterate on it, because we're building for the long term, and building for the long term results in us just shipping and then ultimately refining as we go, and just keeping on refining the machine each and every single day that we go, and saying, hey, big money chases those who solve chaos. I flip the script. What's stopping this from working? So ultimately just asking, what is stopping this from working? What is the chaos within this that is ultimately resulting in you not working towards the main mission that your goal is, or just printing more revenue? Saying, hey, vendor delays turn mess into a predictive alert system for inside Killer Chaos OS. So now we're building a fully now we're building a fully custom Killer Chaos prevention system that we're actively going to be implementing. So basically ultimately just to identify chaos, and also implement strategies in terms of how to combat that chaos. Super hard challenge at the moment to just ultimately just get everything together in terms of how it's going to work, how the fundamentals and everything is going to work, but we're just shipping, and MVPs are the best ways, because we can ultimately just pull in that data, put it in a centralized spot, and then ultimately just refine it, and just keep building feedback loops, because that's super important. And saying, hey, what's the move that you could make? Find one real blocker and kill it by 22 July. Saying, hey, 2 days from now or 3 days from now, you ultimately need to find the blocker and just absolutely just get rid of it and kill it today, so that we can ultimately just move to the next thing that we need to solve for, and ultimately build that MVP, so we can just keep pushing the needle forward. Because like I always say for the past few videos, you move as fast as your biggest constraint, so just solving that constraint just ultimately allows you to move a lot quicker. And then ultimately saying, hey, what is the key question I could ask here, which is, once one problem you could solve to become indispensable. And I think this is super important, to just be having a mindset of saying, hey, how can I make sure that my solution is irreplaceable, in the sense that, hey, no one can just come in and solve what it is that we're solving, because we have to be the number one people that are doing this. And ultimately just having that mindset, I know for a fact into the future it's going to push us to build better and better products. But in order to do that, we first need to ship, and we need to build, and ultimately just understand what it is that we're doing today, so that we can constantly just push the needle forward. And ultimately this also, asking this question ultimately allows us to reach a new level of understanding that ultimately ships how it is that we're building, because we're having a mindset of saying, hey, we want to build this, but we want to make sure that we're indispensable. We're not just simply replaceable, because once you're replaceable, it becomes a lot easier to just get someone else to say, hey, we can do the same thing that they can, but ultimately we need to be the best possible solution providers that we possibly can, and just constantly just have that mindset and saying, hey, what is the growth mindset that we can have here? Because a growth mindset equals a growth pipeline. And why this matters is because opportunities scale with your capacity, which is super important. You grow, then the game grows with you. Ultimately saying, hey, each and every single day that we need to make sure that we're growing, because the game is going to grow with us. And ultimately we need to make sure that I'm actively growing on all fronts, personal, business, and aspect in terms of every single moving part within my life. I need to make sure that I'm just constantly growing, because that creates the pipeline for more opportunities into the future. And this is when I solely believe that, hey, my move, what it is that I do, like, hey, flu hits, I still show up, making sure that I'm still studying the lean startup, the book The Lean Startup, and also the PayPal Mafia, which are probably one of my favorite books. Just saying, and saying, hey, still learning from my network as well. Oh, my bad. From my network as bad from my network as well. And ultimately just saying, hey, I'm still just growing. I'm learning each and everything that I possibly can on a day-to-day basis, watching videos, understanding that, hey, this is how we run certain processes, this is how we can refine our machine, and ultimately reading books as well, because I think books are the gateway to knowledge. And ultimately just picking one growth habit, ultimately saying, hey, I read a book a day for an hour at minimum, and I just keep on doing that, because that is ultimately a growth mindset. Because I always say, like, I think I've said it a couple times in my previous videos, that you could pick up one nugget from a book and ultimately just run with that, and that changes the entire trajectory of your business and also your personal life. Just the daily habits, and ultimately starting now and just saying, hey, I need to make sure that I'm running it for 7 days straight and forming that habit and starting it today. For example, like with these daily videos, we've been running it for 48 days, I think. 48 days, 49, 48, 48 days. And it's been super fun. It's been super fun. It's been hard. Like today, I'm super cooked, but I'm just wanting to get it done, because I told myself that I'm just going to constantly just push, and I'm just going to output a lot more. And I think this is just going to be the most effective way to just say, hey, no matter what, I'm just going to output to the absolute max and just keep pushing the needle forward and saying, hey, key question, what's the one skill that raises your market value instantly? Ultimately, just to increase your market value, because your perceived value is gonna be the reason why you get opportunities and deal. And how can you constantly just increase that perceived value? I think is super important. Just constantly increasing that perceived value and your actual value as well, and ultimately outputting a lot more, I think creates a level of awareness and a level of understanding, because you are ultimately just having that growth mindset, increasing the pipeline, and also just scaling what it is that you're doing on a day-to-day basis, and saying, hey, what is the thing that we could be doing, which is being clear. Your reputation is a magnet, and I think reputation is so important in every single aspect, because your name holds a brand, and ultimately holding that name to the highest level or the highest degree is ultimately something that I always take on a number one priority. I always make sure that, hey, results attract results attract more results. So ultimately saying, hey, we're stacking more results, and ultimately those results ultimately build our reputation and my reputation. So ultimately, let's just continue to build that and just want more trust, and just constantly just keeping pushing the needle forward. Sorry, I'm so cooked right now, but yeah, anyways, just keeping on pushing the needle forward and saying, hey, deliver like no one else. Ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're delivering like no one else, by ultimately building a reputation that is trustworthy, accountable, and also just allows us to show that, hey, we're constantly just pushing the needle forward each and every single day and what it is that we're actively doing. And saying, hey, my move is I save a planner 20 hours a week. And so we're ultimately just saying, hey, we want to implement strategies that ultimately allow us to refine our process, and saying, hey, that one result triggered a word of mouth and higher value clients, because once you have that word of mouth, you ultimately cannot beat that. Word of mouth and just a referral are the gateways. They save you a year or two solely just on trust building, because you said, hey, I know someone, I've worked with him before, I trust him, he can build out my stuff, and ultimately that makes the process a lot easier. Ultimately getting the deal done over the line, which is super important, and saying, hey, what's your move that you could do, which is what deliver one undeniable win by July 25, share it out loud, ultimately saying, hey, I need to make sure that we're sharing what it is that we're doing within our client base, and ultimately building trust with the people around us, because if you're too quiet, no one's gonna know what it is that you're doing. But ultimately finding a way to share that about while also being authentic and saying, hey, what is the key question that we could ask here, which is what's one result that proves you're the real deal? Ultimately just constantly just proving that you're the real deal, not only to your clients but to yourself, to ultimately have a mindset of saying, hey, I'm going to prove to myself each and every single day that I'm going to push the needle forward in every single aspect, and that I'm constantly just hitting the wall, hitting the nail in the wall, and just constantly am pushing the boundaries of what I think is possible today, and pushing that a lot further into the future. And obviously just ultimately tying everything to back to the ultimate vision, ultimate goal of saying, hey, each and every video or each and everything that we're doing is a brick into the foundation. We'll ultimately get a lot of things wrong, we'll ultimately get some things right, but let's make sure that what it is that we're doing on a day-to-day basis is ultimately just pushing the needle forward, and also allowing us to create value, because we know that, hey, we'll get some of these things wrong, but it's ultimately how we think and combat that that is ultimately gonna get us over the line. And I'm super pumped, super excited to be constantly pushing and refining the process in terms of Killer Chaos OS, ultimately learning and just keeping on hitting the nail in the wall, because I know we will get it sometime in the future, where we'll be ultimately able to reshape industries, inspire millions of people, and also create a impact that is super massive. And I'm super bullish that this will happen. We just have to go through each and every single phase, and ultimately just refining the process in terms of becoming the person worthy of attracting opportunities rather than chasing them, because I know that we're just going to get to that stage. But in order to get to that stage, we have to go in the trenches, which we are right now, and ultimately just dig deep and dive deep and ultimately get there. And once we get there, we're just going to push even more further of what we thought was possible today, and ultimately bring a new realm of possibility into the future. So yeah, if you guys enjoyed that video, make sure to leave a comment, follow me on X, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and I will see you guys in the next video.